In the silence of the midnight room, Thomas Grayson knelt on worn floorboards, whispering a trembling prayer. His voice carried the desperation of a soul who had searched too long and found no rest. Shadows pressed against the walls like restless spirits, their movements defying the flicker of a single candle. The air grew heavy, metallic on the tongue, as though reality bent under the weight of an unseen presence. The candle's flame stretched unnaturally tall, bending toward Thomas Grayson, as if listening to his broken plea. He whispered again, his words soaked in guilt. "Please, answer me, even if no one else can." A tremor rolled beneath him, and the boards moaned like they carried ancient grief. The candle burst into a cold white fire, filling the dim chamber with searing brilliance that hurt the eyes but demanded awe. The shadows danced wildly, then merged, shaping themselves into a tall, shifting figure. Its outline glimmered like molten silver, edges refusing to stay still. The silence deepened until the only sound was the pounding of Thomas Grayson's heart. Then a voice resonated not in the air, but within his chest, thunder and whisper at once, "You have been seen." The words burned deeper than fire, carving truth into his soul. He shuddered, clutching the floor, tears streaking his face, for he knew he was no longer alone. Thomas Grayson gasped as the brilliance dimmed, leaving the air electric with dread and awe. The room no longer felt like his own, it had become a temple of judgment. His prayer had broken through some veil, and now he faced the consequence. The shadows leaned toward him as though listening. He whispered again, his throat raw. "Why me?" The silence mocked him until the voice thundered within his chest once more. It was neither cruel nor kind, but absolute. "Because you asked." Thomas Grayson fell forward, forehead striking the floor, his body trembling with the weight of words too heavy for any mortal heart. The scent of smoke lingered, though the candle burned without wick. Thomas Grayson raised his head, his eyes swollen with tears, staring into the space where the figure had stood. He longed to see it again, though terror gripped his soul. The silence thickened, broken only by his hoarse voice. "I am nothing. I deserve nothing." His words shattered in the air, and yet the presence did not withdraw. It pulsed unseen, like a heartbeat too vast for walls to contain. Thomas Grayson pressed his palm to his chest, stunned by the lingering vibration that rattled his bones. His soul had been marked by something neither human nor earthly. "Show me what you want," he whispered, half begging, half demanding. His plea trembled like a fragile bridge over despair. The air shifted, and shadows coiled across the walls in patterns like scripture, etched in darkness. The room became a canvas of moving symbols he could not read, yet his spirit understood. The silence broke with a final resonance. The voice returned, its tone vast and steady. "You prayed for an answer. But answers come with cost." Thomas Grayson flinched, heart racing as he struggled to rise. His legs shook beneath him, and he stumbled back against the wall, eyes locked on the last flickers of silver light. The room stilled, the shadows frozen in reverence. His journey had begun, and though fear clung to him, his spirit was already tethered to something beyond himself. The dawn crept through the cracked shutters of the old room, soft light scattering across the floor where Thomas Grayson still trembled. He had not slept, haunted by the memory of the silver-lit figure. Each heartbeat carried the echo of the voice that declared, "You have been seen." His body felt marked, his soul pierced with a wound that was invisible but unhealed. When the door creaked open, he flinched, expecting more shadows, but instead, a calm voice broke the silence. Samuel Hayes said, "You called into the darkness, and now you cannot return unchanged." Thomas Grayson lifted his weary eyes to the older man's steady gaze, a stranger yet somehow familiar. The weight of the unseen pressed harder, and his lips moved with fear. "Why would something like that answer me?" Samuel Hayes stepped closer, every motion deliberate, carrying the gravity of faith shaped by years of battle with unseen forces. He answered with quiet conviction, "Because heaven listens, even when you doubt its silence." The words struck Thomas Grayson with the force of truth, though he resisted them, his soul unsure whether to lean into hope or flee from it. Thomas Grayson dragged himself upright, clutching the wall for strength as his eyes studied Samuel Hayes. The older man's presence carried no menace, yet there was weight in his voice that felt unshakable. Thomas Grayson whispered, "You speak as though you knew it would come." Samuel Hayes folded his hands before him, gaze unbroken. "I have seen prayers answered in ways no one believes, until they are consumed by the fire themselves." The room thickened with quiet reverence, the memory of white fire still etched into the walls. Thomas Grayson's hands trembled as he pressed them together, torn between disbelief and yearning. His voice cracked as he said, "Then what happens now?" Samuel Hayes lowered his head slightly, his tone heavy with both warning and promise. "Now you walk the path of the called, whether your feet are ready or not." The words settled in the room like stone, impossible to move. The silence lingered between them, heavy as judgment. Thomas Grayson lowered his gaze, ashamed of the fragility in his trembling. His voice broke as he said, "I am not strong enough for this. I cannot face what waits in shadows." Samuel Hayes stepped forward, his expression unwavering, though his eyes carried compassion. "Strength is not demanded of you yet. What is demanded is surrender." The words cut deep, stirring both defiance and longing. Thomas Grayson shook his head, fists clenched, muttering, "Surrender only leads to pain." Samuel Hayes' voice softened, yet held undeniable authority. "No, surrender is the seed of redemption. It begins where pride ends." Thomas Grayson's breath stuttered, for he felt truth in the words, though fear fought against it. The unseen presence from the night before seemed to stir faintly, as though listening still. Thomas Grayson turned away, pacing across the small room as though trying to escape its walls. The shadows shifted faintly as his restless movements disturbed the fragile stillness. His words poured like confession. "I prayed for an answer, but I did not ask for chains." Samuel Hayes followed him with his gaze, his tone quiet yet cutting through the turmoil. "Chains bind only when you fight the hand that holds them. Freedom comes when you trust what carries you." The words pressed against the fractures of Thomas Grayson's soul, threatening to break them open. He pressed his forehead to the wall, shoulders shaking as he whispered, "I do not know how to trust anymore." Samuel Hayes stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then learn, for the shadows already marked you. You cannot remain who you were." The air grew heavier as the memory of the silver-lit figure weighed upon them both. Samuel Hayes moved closer, kneeling so his eyes met Thomas Grayson's downcast face. His voice was low, steady, carved with conviction. "You are not forsaken. You are chosen." Thomas Grayson lifted his head, eyes red with sleepless tears, and for a fleeting moment he saw hope in the older man's words. Yet fear clung to him still, whispering of unworthiness. He said softly, "I am nothing. Why would light choose me?" Samuel Hayes reached out, resting a firm hand on his shoulder. "Because broken vessels shine brighter when filled with fire." The words struck Thomas Grayson like prophecy, leaving him trembling between despair and awakening. The day wore on, though light in the room felt dimmer than it should. Thomas Grayson sat on the edge of a broken chair, his mind circling the memory of the silver-lit figure. Samuel Hayes remained close, silent yet steady, like a guardian watching over a trembling flame. The stillness broke as the door swung open, and Daniel Cross entered, his steps sharp against the creaking boards. His gaze swept the room with suspicion, lingering on the faint burn marks left on the walls. Daniel Cross scoffed, his voice laced with disbelief. "So this is what consumed your night? Shadows and fire that no one else can see?" Thomas Grayson lowered his head, his voice weak. "It was real. It spoke to me." Daniel Cross shook his head, pacing like a man sharpening arguments with every step. "Ah, you are deluded, Thomas. You hear echoes of grief, not voices of heaven." Samuel Hayes raised his hand, commanding stillness. Careful with your words, what he saw was no hallucination. The tension between them thickened, the air caught between faith and reason, both unwilling to yield. Thomas Grayson gripped his knees, as though holding himself together, the memory of the voice still echoing inside his chest. Daniel Cross circled him like a hawk, his tone sharp. Thomas, you are clinging to fantasy because you cannot bear your own silence. Samuel Hayes met Daniel Cross's cutting words with calm resolve, saying, doubt has its place, but you mistake it for wisdom. Not all things unseen are false. Daniel Cross laughed bitterly, his eyes narrowing. Spirits, visions, voices, these are for children and dreamers. Do not confuse his weakness with revelation. The insult pierced, and Thomas Grayson flinched as though struck. His heart wrestled between shame and stubborn faith. Samuel Hayes stepped forward, his voice firm but patient. If your eyes refuse the light, it does not mean the light is not shining. Daniel Cross crossed his arms, unwilling to be moved, and silence fell heavy in the room. Thomas Grayson rose to his feet with trembling resolve, though his voice wavered. Daniel, I know what I saw. It was not grief. It was not silence. It was fire that burned without flame, a voice that left scars in my soul. Daniel Cross stepped closer, eyes fierce, replying coldly, and scars are proof of madness, not miracles. Samuel Hayes moved between them, steady as stone, his voice cutting through the rising clash. Enough. This is not madness. This is calling. The words carried an authority neither man could deny, though Daniel Cross's jaw clenched with frustration. Thomas Grayson's shoulders sagged under the weight of disbelief pressing against his fragile faith. He whispered, barely audible, why can you not believe me? Daniel Cross's voice softened slightly but still cut deep. Because belief demands surrender, and I see none in you yet. The truth in the challenge struck Thomas Grayson harder than anger could. The air felt heavier, every breath carrying tension. Thomas Grayson turned toward the wall, pressing his palm against the marks where the fire had once blazed. His voice broke. I begged for an answer. It came, whether you believe me or not. Daniel Cross's voice followed like a hammer striking steel. An answer from shadows is no answer worth keeping. Samuel Hayes spoke with quiet strength. Then tell me, Daniel, what is worth keeping if not truth revealed in fire? Daniel Cross's silence lingered, but his defiance burned in his eyes. Thomas Grayson pressed his forehead to the wall, whispering words he barely understood. The memory of the voice, you have been seen, haunted him, unshakable, undeniable, even against Daniel Cross's accusations. The room quivered under the weight of things unsaid, faith and reason locked in endless struggle. The silence fractured as Thomas Grayson turned back, his eyes red but his voice steadier. I may not understand, but I cannot deny what has marked me. Daniel Cross shook his head slowly, a trace of pity shadowing his stern features. Then you walk blind, and blindness will break you. Samuel Hayes stepped closer to Thomas Grayson, his voice carrying quiet conviction. Blindness only breaks the one who refuses to be led. He will not walk alone. Thomas Grayson's trembling slowed, the words weaving fragile threads of strength through his soul. Daniel Cross exhaled sharply, muttering, then let your faith be tested, and we will see what remains. The words fell like a challenge, one that none of them could turn from. The path ahead had been drawn, and it would demand more than belief. It would demand sacrifice. The room had grown darker, though daylight still pressed faintly at the edges of the shutters. Thomas Grayson sat in silence, torn between Daniel Cross's bitter challenges and Samuel Hayes' quiet certainty. The air shifted, carrying the sound of hesitant footsteps. The door opened slowly, and Eleanor Price entered, her eyes hollow with memories she could not hide. She clutched a small wooden cross, worn smooth by hands that had gripped it in despair. Her voice wavered as she said, I heard what happened here last night. I came because I know what it means to be marked by shadows. Thomas Grayson's gaze rose in confusion, while Daniel Cross sneered with suspicion. Samuel Hayes' face softened, as though he had long expected her arrival. Eleanor Price stepped forward, trembling, her words breaking the stillness. "I was once consumed by darkness. I begged for release. But forgiveness came only when I dared to speak my shame aloud." Eleanor Price stepped closer, her hands tightening around the cross as if it anchored her trembling. Her voice carried the weight of confession. "I was not innocent. I betrayed those who trusted me. My sins carved scars no one can see." Thomas Grayson watched her, his breath shallow, recognizing his own guilt reflected in her brokenness. Daniel Cross muttered, "Confessions do not change truth. Shadows do not forgive." Eleanor Price's eyes filled with tears as she replied, "But forgiveness is not earned, it is given. I fought it, I rejected it, yet it came when I laid my past bare." Samuel Hayes placed a hand on the edge of the table, speaking with steady strength. "Eleanor speaks truth. Redemption begins not in perfection but in surrender." Thomas Grayson's chest tightened, for her words echoed his secret fears, and her broken voice carried a hope he had not dared believe. The silence deepened, heavy with words unspoken. Eleanor Price pressed her hand to her chest, voice breaking with pain. "I harmed lives beyond repair, and I lived in shadows that whispered every night. Yet when light touched me, it did not condemn. It called me to stand again." Thomas Grayson's eyes glistened, torn by the reflection of his own despair and her confession. Daniel Cross frowned, muttering, "Stories of redemption are nothing more than comfort for those afraid to face consequence." Samuel Hayes looked at him with patience, saying, "And yet consequence and mercy walk together. Only those who bow to one discover the other." Eleanor Price turned her tear-streaked face toward Thomas Grayson, whispering, "You are not alone in guilt. The shadows that answer are not only wrath, but mercy hidden in flame." Her words struck like a mirror to his soul, tearing down the walls he had clung to. Thomas Grayson stood suddenly, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the scorched wall where fire had once burned. His voice cracked with desperation. "If mercy can come to you, Eleanor, why do shadows still haunt me?" Eleanor Price stepped forward, her eyes filled with compassion, though her own scars were raw. "Because you still believe you must carry them alone." Daniel Cross folded his arms, smirking faintly. "Or perhaps because there is no mercy, only madness dressed in faith." Samuel Hayes countered firmly. "Or perhaps because truth requires breaking before it can heal." Thomas Grayson pressed both hands to his head, overwhelmed, whispering, "I do not know how much more I can bear." Eleanor Price reached out, her trembling hand hovering near his arm, her voice tender. "You do not bear it alone. I speak because I once believed the same lie." The air grew dense with unseen weight, pressing against each of them as if listening. Eleanor Price's voice quivered but grew stronger. "I confess so you know the truth. Shadows do not hold the final word. Mercy came for me, and it will come for you if you let it." Thomas Grayson's chest heaved, his tears falling freely as he whispered, "Then perhaps I am not cursed." Samuel Hayes placed a steady hand on his shoulder, saying, "No curse endures when grace is chosen." Daniel Cross turned away, muttering, "You all cling to illusions, but the world does not forgive." Yet his voice wavered, betraying unease he could not hide. Eleanor Price lifted her cross high, the dim light catching its worn edges, and the room seemed to pause in reverence. Thomas Grayson felt the first fragile spark of hope pierce the darkness within him. The room trembled with a presence beyond flesh and stone, as if unseen hands pressed against the walls. Thomas Grayson sat frozen, his tears still damp, when the air thickened with a sudden chill. Eleanor Price clutched her cross tighter, whispering a prayer too faint to hear. Samuel Hayes closed his eyes, his lips forming words of faith, prepared for what he had long awaited. Daniel Cross stiffened, unease breaking through his scorn as his gaze darted to the dark corners of the room. A sound like wind without source filled the space, and light flickered violently across the scorched wall. From the shifting glow emerged a figure radiant yet veiled, cloaked in garments of shimmering white flame. The being spoke not with sound, but with a resonance that struck every heart at once. "The shadows answered your cry, Thomas Grayson, because the heavens heard what you hid in silence." His body shook as the revelation pierced him, for the truth was deeper than his confession. The brilliance filled every corner, leaving no shadow untouched. Thomas Grayson's voice cracked as he cried out, "Why me? I am unworthy." The divine messenger's gaze turned upon him, and though no eyes could be seen, its presence seared deeper than sight. The voice resounded like thunder and whisper, "Because in your weakness lies the seed of strength. What is broken can carry greater light." Eleanor Price fell to her knees, tears streaming as she whispered, "It is true. Mercy found me as well." Samuel Hayes lifted his head, eyes wet with awe. "Speak, messenger of heaven, for we are listening." Daniel Cross clenched his fists, muttering under his breath, "This is delusion dressed as revelation." Yet even he could not hide the tremor in his hands. The revelation did not bend to disbelief. It demanded to be received. Thomas Grayson trembled as the words wrapped around his heart, like fire and balm. He whispered, "If light has chosen me, then what am I to do?" The divine messenger extended a hand, its form shimmering with unearthly brilliance. "You must walk the path carved in both shadow and flame. What was hidden will rise, and what was broken will be made whole." Samuel Hayes bowed his head deeply, whispering, "This is the call, Thomas. Do not refuse it." Eleanor Price reached toward him, her voice soft yet urgent. "Do not let fear steal what is meant for you." Daniel Cross shook his head sharply, his voice low but defiant. "This voice binds you with chains of illusion. Do not believe it." The room itself seemed to shudder in response, as if creation opposed his words. The divine messenger's voice echoed again, each word striking with weight, impossible to ignore. "Thomas Grayson, the fire does not come to destroy you, but to refine. The shadows answer prayers, but the light reveals truth." His knees buckled, and he collapsed forward, sobbing into his hands. Samuel Hayes knelt beside him, his hands steady upon his back, whispering prayers that wove with the resonance of heaven. Eleanor Price bowed her head, clutching her cross tightly against her chest, her lips trembling with gratitude. Daniel Cross turned away, muttering, "Truth cannot be wrapped in riddles." Yet his eyes betrayed conflict, for even his disbelief faltered before the burning presence. The messenger stood still, its radiance filling the silence with awe. The final words from the divine messenger thundered with authority, yet dripped with mercy. "What begins in shadow must end in light. You are not forsaken, you are chosen to bear witness." Thomas Grayson lifted his tear-streaked face, fragile yet burning with new strength. His voice shook as he whispered, "Then I will not run." Samuel Hayes' eyes filled with quiet pride as he whispered, "Then the journey has truly begun." Eleanor Price pressed her cross to her lips, tears of hope breaking across her face. Daniel Cross stood frozen, torn between disbelief and awe, his silence louder than words. The divine messenger's form began to fade, the radiance dimming but leaving an indelible mark upon every soul in the room. The silence that followed was not empty, it was sacred. The night descended swift and suffocating, as if the heavens themselves recoiled. The room that once glowed with fire now groaned with shadows twisting like serpents. Thomas Grayson clutched his chest, gasping under an unseen weight. Samuel Hayes lifted his arms, his voice strong, "Stand firm, for light has not abandoned you." Eleanor Price fell to her knees, gripping her cross, whispering fervent prayers that cracked with desperation. Daniel Cross pressed against the wall, his face pale as doubt warred with fear. Then, from the darkest corner, the shadows gathered into a form unlike the messenger. A figure of smoke and ash loomed tall, its voice like a chorus of rage. "You dare to call light in a place where only despair reigns." The ground quaked beneath their feet, and Thomas Grayson cried out, "What do you want of me?" The dark figure laughed, a sound that shredded courage. "Only your soul." The floorboards cracked as the antagonist advanced, its form shifting like storm clouds fed by fire. Samuel Hayes' voice cut through the chaos. "You hold no power here, except what fear grants you." The antagonist's laughter shook the beams above them. "Then fear will be my crown." Thomas Grayson staggered backward, whispering, "I cannot fight this." Eleanor Price shouted, her voice breaking, "Then do not fight alone." Daniel Cross clenched his fists, trembling as his disbelief wavered before the sight. This cannot be real. Shadows cannot speak. Yet the figure towered over them, undeniable, suffocating. Its words dripped with venom. "You are mine, Thomas Grayson, because you prayed in despair." The name echoed like chains around his spirit. Samuel Hayes stepped forward, defiant. "No, he is seen by light greater than your darkness." The clash had begun. The walls shuddered, as if the house itself wished to collapse. Thomas Grayson fell to his knees, hands pressed to his ears against the booming voice of the antagonist. "You begged for an answer, and it was I who came first." The words pierced like daggers. Eleanor Price crawled toward him, her cross outstretched, her voice shaking. "Do not believe the lie, Thomas." The light answered too. Samuel Hayes raised his hand high, his prayer now thunderous. "The fire of heaven consumes deception." Daniel Cross' lips parted, his disbelief crumbling as the horror before him grew undeniable. He whispered, "This cannot be a dream." The antagonist lunged closer, shadows reaching like claws, its hiss echoing. "He belongs to despair, not mercy." Thomas Grayson lifted his tear-soaked face, whispering through trembling lips, "Then let mercy fight for me." A sudden burst of unseen wind roared through the room, scattering dust like sparks. Samuel Hayes shouted over the storm, "Light, reveal your strength." The antagonist recoiled, its form flickering as if resisting an unseen force. Eleanor Price pressed her cross against the floor, weeping, "Break these chains, Lord of mercy." Daniel Cross stumbled forward, torn between disbelief and the terror of silence. "If this is true, then prove it now," he cried. Thomas Grayson rose slowly, his body trembling, yet his voice gained strength. "I am not yours. I was seen. I was chosen." The antagonist screamed, shadows twisting violently, walls splintering with the force of its rage. The battle surged not in weapons, but in words, faith clashing against despair. The air was alive with unseen fire. The climax thundered as the antagonist towered, its roar shaking the rafters. Thomas Grayson stood firm though trembling, his eyes blazing with fragile courage. "You will not claim me. Light burns even here." The air erupted, the remnants of silver fire flaring once more along the walls. Samuel Hayes shouted, his voice like a weapon, "The truth has spoken, and darkness will bow." Eleanor Price sobbed aloud, clutching her cross as if it were part of her soul. Daniel Cross staggered backward, his disbelief shattered by the spectacle before him. The antagonist writhed, its form collapsing inward, hissing, "This is not the end." With one final scream, the figure dissolved into nothing, leaving the air heavy but free. Thomas Grayson collapsed into Samuel Hayes' arms, his body shaking, but his spirit no longer chained. The clash had ended, though the journey was not finished. The silence after the clash was deeper than any thunder, as if the world held its breath. Thomas Grayson remained in the arms of Samuel Hayes, his body trembling, but his spirit steady. Eleanor Price's tears traced rivers of relief across her face, her cross held firm against her lips. Daniel Cross leaned against the broken wall, his disbelief shattered, eyes wide with questions he could not voice. The air carried the fading echo of the divine messenger's words, as though heaven had written them into the beams of the house. "What begins in shadow must end in light." Thomas Grayson whispered, his voice raw yet resolute, "Then let it end with me standing, not kneeling in despair." Samuel Hayes smiled faintly, whispering, "You have been refined by fire." Eleanor Price lifted her gaze to the dim ceiling, whispering prayers of thanks. Daniel Cross lowered his head, silently battling the truth breaking his soul. The dawn crept through the shattered window, painting the room with pale gold. Samuel Hayes stood tall, his eyes shining with quiet reverence. The night has passed, but the journey still calls. Thomas Grayson pushed himself to his feet, swaying but unbroken. I will walk it, even if the path burns. Eleanor Price touched his arm, her voice soft and trembling. You are not alone. The shadows may test, but the light will guide. Daniel Cross laughed bitterly, though his tone cracked. Guide? I saw only terror and fire. Samuel Hayes turned to him, his expression gentle. Faith often begins where reason ends. Daniel Cross shook his head, but his eyes betrayed longing for belief. The golden light filled the room as if confirming the truth Samuel Hayes spoke. They stepped outside into the morning air, where mist clung to the earth like a veil. Thomas Grayson inhaled deeply, the cold air filling lungs once clenched by despair. Eleanor Price closed her eyes, whispering thanks for light's return. Samuel Hayes spoke firmly. This place will not hold you captive any longer. You are meant to walk free. Thomas Grayson nodded, voice low but filled with strength. Then, I will no longer hide in shadows. Daniel Cross followed slowly, his eyes scanning the sky as if expecting it to tear open again. I do not understand this, but I cannot deny what I saw. Samuel Hayes answered, You do not need to understand to be changed. The mist shifted, golden rays cutting through like blades of promise. They walked along the dirt path, the ruins of night fading behind them. Samuel Hayes kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his voice steady. Faith is not proven in safety, but in storms survive. Thomas Grayson pressed his hand to his chest, whispering, Then I am still alive because I was seen. Eleanor Price smiled softly, her voice tender. And because mercy chose you when you thought you were forgotten. Daniel Cross looked away, muttering, or cursed. Samuel Hayes turned to him with patient strength. Even curses can break when truth is spoken. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the remnants of despair like ashes scattered by grace. Their footsteps marked a path reborn, one written not by fear, but by fire endured. At the crest of the hill they stopped. The valley spread beneath them like a canvas of light and shadow. Thomas Grayson stood at the front, his voice rising with new strength. The shadows answered my prayers, but the light gave them meaning. I am no longer forsaken. Samuel Hayes placed a hand upon his shoulder, whispering, You are now a witness. Eleanor Price's tears glistened in the morning sun, her cross lifted high in silent thanks. Daniel Cross stood apart, his silence thick, but his eyes softened with the weight of what he had seen. The breeze carried their breath into the sky, as though heaven itself received it. In the stillness that followed, the journey's end became its beginning. The shadows had been faced, and the light beyond them would never be denied.